Hey, team players, welcome back. Bob left me with a horrible, horrible
Welcome.
challenge at the end of last week, which was come up with a conversation about fantasy value of the New York Football Giants. And guys, I'm just going to get a little real for you for a minute. You ever have a car that leaks motor oil on the street and you start staring at that pinkish switch of water? And you start thinking like, oh, maybe there's something really cool and artistic here. And then eventually you realize the only reason you think that's because you're high. That's what it's like trying to come up with an answer to say that there's going to be a quality answer for the New York Football Giants this football season in terms of fantasy football. That being said, I understand the only pathway can happen. I can give it to you. I just don't think it's realistic or viable. So, Bob, that's my starting point for the Giants.
Okay, so let's get in a little bit, and for all those that are watching this episode, we are picking up where we left off last week, just discussing some teams that we're concerned about based off of their moves in the offseason or lack thereof, and just thinking about in terms of viability of fantasy players versus the expected value going into the draft. Teams like Seattle, where some players are overvalued in terms of what we might receive back. And in this part of the episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about the New York Giants. Now, going on to, our lads and looking at the depth chart of the New York Giants, nothing about this team from an offensive perspective really says I want to own a piece of it. And this is, this is very similar to a less extent, very similar to how most people thought about the Los Angeles Rams last year going into the fantasy season. We knew.
The Rams at least were a quality team with a good coach.
No, they weren't. So why I say this is because it's not a defined connection, but why I say this is that you specifically were concerned about the longevity of Matt Stafford and what was behind Matt Stafford in terms of injury concerns.
I was, but again, I still would have taken Cooper Kupp in the fifth round.
Let me speak. Okay. Then we come in and we look at the wide receiver perspective. And out of all the players, Cooper Kupp stood out to most people, and he was drafted really high, but then he got injured. And then, we had some things to think about there. But nobody was really looking at Cam Akers until the running back dead zone. Nobody was looking at Kyron Williams at all. Nobody had Puka Nacua on their radar until very, 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 very late. And there was no other, and maybe you were thinking about Tutu Atwell around the same time. But, in regards to that is where this comparison that I'm about to make comes into place, is that we had a team going into the season with a couple question marks, a couple big concerns about who's going to step in, what's going to happen based off of player personnel, and what was happening in the previous season. Now, locking back into the Giants, when we looked at the Giants a couple seasons ago, they had Saquon Barkley. They had what looked like their quarterback in Daniel Jones. He was playing not terribly well, but really, efficiently decent enough that it was able to produce some pretty stellar games for Saquon Barkley, some decent games for other fantasy players on the team, specifically Daniel Jones, because he was a running-based touchdown performer in terms of fantasy football. Now, when we go to Fantasy Pros and we kind of look at where the current ADPs are kind of landing and the current rankings of where these wide receivers are showing up in terms of lists, QBs, and lists, and, overall. A concerning but interesting decision that you will have to make this upcoming fantasy season. Now, in terms of quarterbacks, in terms of making decisions on quarterbacks, usually you really don't want players tied to the 26th ranked quarterback out of all of the quarterbacks in the NFL. Usually that's not a good starting point. Yet we're sitting here with Malik Neighbors as being ranked as a very high wide receiver in terms of wide receiver rankings. And in terms of overall rankings, we have Malik Neighbors, the newly minted number one wide receiver for the New York Giants,
Well, he's by far the most talented player in that receiver
sitting
room.
up
That's
there
not close.
Sitting up there with an overall ranking among 250 players of 46, with his best draft, or with the highest position that he's been taken at 24, the lowest being 81. He ranks about 46th overall, 26th amongst wide receivers on this Fantasy Pros list.
Mm-hmm.
The next best player, that is a skill position player, is Devin Singletary, who is popping off, who had some really good games, really broke out a little bit with the Texans last year, is sitting at running back 33, ADP around 74 to 121, and overall ranking on their list of 109. The next viable players in their overall rankings sit at 174, 205, and 214. And that is Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton, who Slayton had a really good season last year for his value, with like around 770 yards and a couple of touchdowns. So not great, but still a little bit of value there. And Hyatt and Robinson had some rookie and injury woes that were happening. So, Joe, why bring and then we have Darren Waller and Daniel Bellinger sitting down here at like tight end 27, tight end 29.
Waller's not even sure if he still was a player or not.
Exactly, not even on the radar. So, focusing strictly on these skill position players tied to a quarterback ranked so low, when we take a look and we say, I don't want a piece of that pie, but at the same point in time, when the pie is being enjoyed that late, there begs the question for us to say, is there value with the New York Giants? And while I don't see any value with Malik Neighbors, guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, and Darius Slayton definitely have my attention, to the fact that, we're sitting here at Daniel Jones. The next quarterbacks below him are J.J. McCarthy, tied to one of the best wide receivers in the league. And we were talking up Minnesota a little while back. Then coming out of that, quarterback number 28 on their list, Russell Wilson, Pittsburgh Steelers. We were talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers situation. Justin Fields is ranked 31 on their quarterback list.
Yeah.
Bryce Young at 29 and Drake May at 30. And we said we didn't want to really touch any New England Patriot. But the value of some of these players is right. And when you're looking late in the draft, especially at these guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, like Jalen Hyatt, is there a pathway that they can put together some pretty decent wide receiver 4 or flex numbers? Or is it really truly a year where the Giants just aren't worth anything?
Yeah, so let's break this down. First off, I don't think the Rams are the real comparison to last year. I think it's Houston, because Houston was going to be horrible, and they had a bunch of receivers that were kind of like, we'll get them late, and if they hit, they hit. They just happen to hit the home run with Stroud. We know Daniel Jones ain't it. So let's just back up and look at the Giants roster from the actions in which they took place, and they did it here. To me, it all starts with their offensive line. Evan Neal was a top 10 pick in 2022. They brought in a replacement for him to fight in camp. You tell me you busted on a top 10 pick. All right, cool. Look at the rest of the picks. Surely bring in Neighbors. All right. The entire rest of this offseason was get another pass rusher, Brian Burns from Carolina. Second and third pick, starting safety, second cornerback to pair with the first round pick from last year, who also was a corner. This team is trying to win low-scoring football games. And then here's the crux of all of it. With their projected starting 5 receivers that will make the opening day roster, only one of them is taller than 6 foot. So you have a bunch of short people with a quarterback who does not throw the ball well downfield trying to win low-scoring games. The only conceivable way that this becomes successful is a power running team. That is the only option. Now, Daniel Jones is basically going to have to be a very light version, without the arm, of Allen. That's what he's going to have to be. Singletary has proven he is not a running back you can hand the ball and trust, a la, I don't know, King Henry. One who has no passing game around it but can carry it, as Henry did for many years in Tennessee. So if I'm trying to build the system that can say, how can the Giants be successful in fantasy, I'm looking at this team building assets, what we actually spent. The New York Giants completely unsubtly built the nest for next year's first-round pick. They have built the nest now. They have a defense that is going to slow people down. They have now what they believe to be a number one receiver, although I believe they completely picked the wrong one. And they are trying to solve the offensive line issue. So if I'm willing to think about what the future has in store in the actual NFL, they will have a top 5 pick. They will have probably the first quarterback off of the board. And their second round pick come around is going to be another skill player, probably another receiver, possibly a running back. So you add all that up. It's a defense that's trying to play low-scoring games that the only chance they have is to be more physical than the 2 most physical offensive line in the league, which is the Cowboys and the Giants. So probably not going to happen. They're a team that cannot throw the ball downfield, that has 0 height. Their tallest player that's a projected starter isn't sure he wants to come back and play anymore. In Waller. I don't see a scenario that Daniel Jones isn't running for his life and gets injured again. So when I look at this and try to build the scenario of the Giant worth having, Jones is the only viable option because Drew Lock ain't taking anyone's job.
Here, let me before
not over that contract. Jones just
before you go into that, Jones really isn't a viable option, and I want to address.
No, he's not. You need to be in a 2 quarterback league before he even comes into play. So if you're not in a 2 quarterback league, there is no Giant worth considering.
Many people in New Jersey and New York were on the Tommy DeVito bandwagon last year. For various reasons. For various reasons. But there is clamor and rumors to say that, and not even rumors, fact to say, this is put up or shut up for Daniel Jones. And there's a very realistic pathway. There's a very realistic pathway that he loses his job before week 1. Now,
I don't think that's the case because of the contract.
With that said, I want to just focus on the value of these players because obviously Jones has no value as a fantasy skill position or as a fantasy asset.
So this is why I think back to Houston, because all those receivers you went through going to last year was Houston middle of the round. And what made Collins and Noah pop? Stroud, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Giants, asset-wise, have spent better assets on their line than the Giants have. At the end of the day, it's everything you said, Bob. You don't trust in a receiver with a quarterback who can't throw the ball, let alone one that is schematically drawn wrong. If you have a quarterback who's having problems getting the ball out, you give him a tall jumping type. And don't get me wrong, I know there's not a ton of Jamar Chases out there, but you at least go in that direction. It would not be a bad idea if Houston figures out how to get Higgins on this roster, with the one glaring exception, it is still Daniel Jones throwing them the ball.
So here's the deal. I'm going to throw out a couple players for everybody that's just tuned in. We're talking about some teams that have some issues. Either they went out and got some pieces that it maybe doesn't make any sense. Maybe they went out and didn't really do much to change the landscape of their team and how that's going to affect fantasy prospects for the next year. The point I brought up to Joe at the beginning of the episode is that, and last week, is talking a little bit about the New York Giants here, where, where is the value, if any, in any Giants player? So here's what I'm going to posit to you, Joe.
Maybe you can make an argument for Singletary, but I'd rather be shopping the receivers that are around him.
As I look at Fantasy Pros, and we're using Fantasy Pros overall rankings because it's a pretty good amalgamation of things.
Yes,
as I look at the board, Malik Neighbors isn't even on my radar, tied to the 26th ranked quarterback in their list because at that same point in time, I have players to consider like Trey McBride. I have players to consider like Zay Flowers, CJ Stroud, James Cook, Christian Kirk, Anthony Richardson, T. Higgins. He's not even in my frame.
He's not.
Now, the next best player is Devin Singletary. Where Devin Singletary falls, he's totally on my radar, particularly if I have gone maybe a little bit wide receiver heavy and I'm looking for a running back 4 or running back 3. Now, the guy has never gone over 1,000 yards rushing. He's always hovered around 800 yards. He's gotten a couple passes here and there, but it hasn't been like proficient enough.
Yeah,
but
it won't be in this system.
As I'm looking at the players in that same vein, according to Fantasy Pros here on their overall top 250 rankings, Devin Singletary is sitting around running back 33. If I'm looking at running backs in that same regard, I'm looking at the dilemma that I had a couple weeks ago with Washington running backs. We're looking at a guy like Tyler Lockett. We do want to touch on Seattle this year. Tight ends like Ferguson and Goddard, whose values are really interesting. Also, TJ Hawkinson, Christian Watson, Jacoby Myers, who we touched on a couple weeks back, Brock Bowers, and a couple of quarterbacks. The next best player. So there is value in Devin Singletary.
The only reason you say there's value is because you don't like anyone else around him.
Now,
I wouldn't take Singletary out of most of that group.
Now, here's the other thing. When it comes to the next best Giants player, and this is where the value potentially could be. I'm not.
Well, now you're just taking wild charts at the end of your draft and hoping that the number 2 receiver for the Giants goes off.
Not really here. I mean, this is potentially pick 136 to 200. So 136. We're talking about
between the 13th and 20th rounds.
These are still players, especially if you're in best ball leagues, especially if you're looking for players to turn it up a couple of weeks in the season. This is where you're probably going to look for them. If I gave you a choice between Marvin Mims, Miles Sanders, Rashad Bateman, Wan'Dale Robinson, Tucker Kraft, you might say, okay, I can make a point for Tucker Kraft.
I'll take Mims all day over all that group.
But again, Mims is in a terrible situation as well. We don't know what's happening in Denver.
I know he scores.
Coming down to Jalen Hyatt. Jalen Hyatt's sitting there with the least trusted player on our list in Alexander Madison. Kickers, another set of rookie wide receivers, Michael Mayer, who may have just lost his job, and some defenses. So, if I had and this is where Darius Slayton falls, if I had a choice between taking a second defense or a first defense and taking a chance on Jalen Hyatt, I'm most likely going to take a chance on Hyatt because there is at least maybe a chance that at least 1 or 2, maybe 3 weeks in the season that I plug him into my flex and potentially he gets 3 or 4 receptions in a PPR league plus about 40
yards. Well, the other thing you get from Hyatt that you don't get with other teams is one of the other receivers ahead of him is going to get hurt. So at least 2 weeks he's going to be slated as the number 1. There is some value in best ball leagues taking both Hodgins and Hyatt late because of that fact. I would, if you're looking at the deep cut Giants for super late, Hodgins to me is the one worth doing. And here's the whole reason. He's the only one on the team over 6 foot. He's 6'4". So when you look at the different body type, he's going to be the one who's going up to get those few jump balls they trust Daniel Jones to throw.
But then here's the other thing, Joe, is that this division, other than maybe the Commanders, is pretty stacked on defense. So at least 4 games a year, you're not starting any Giant. And so, the value in taking Malik Neighbors
There's 18 games a year I know I'm not starting a Giant.
Malik Neighbors that high just doesn't make any sense. And people drafting him that high, I get it.
In a Dynasty league, I don't even think it makes sense.
In Dynasty, it does because depending on your position in the draft, he is the guy to go after. But
it makes sense to me at the end of the first round if you believe the Giants are drafting a quarterback.
And that's the point. In Dynasty, he's going to get some production because he's going to be the number 1 wide receiver. But the Giants had a couple guys that they tried as the main threat last year. And other than Darius Slayton going over 700 yards, none of them cracked, I believe, 500 yards. So it's a very, it's a quiet late round interesting picks. But if you plan on taking a Giant early, you better watch out for disappointment. So moving from the
Giants, I am
Giants,
sure about this. This is the end Giant note. If their defense is not in top 5 in points against, they will be drafting in the top 5.
Yeah,
I know that about the Giants.
And that's fair. Jumping ship to the next team that is on our discussion point too is the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks, back in the previous season, not last season, but the previous season before that, we had some really good fantasy performances from Seattle players, and that was all tied to the resurgence of Geno Smith. Then in the back half of the season, Geno Smith seemed to have been figured out, and those performances went downhill. Now, when it comes to last year, Geno went from having 30 touchdowns to having 20 touchdowns and almost an 800-yard passing differential, and not much different in terms of the interceptions. When we look at where these Seattle players are ranked, again, using Fantasy Pros, going back up to the top of my list, we have DK Metcalf as being the top Seattle player on this list at wide receiver 22, going anywhere between 25 and 47, overall 38. The next player on the list is Kenny Walker, running back 17, going anywhere between 33 and 67. We also have Jackson Smith and Jigba, wide receiver 40, going anywhere between 59 and 120. Tyler Lockett, wide receiver 45, going between 91 and 120. Charbonnet, again, we don't know how Seattle's going to use their running backs. We do know running backs get hurt in the NFL. 101 to 139. Geno Smith, again, it's a weird situation again, but Geno Smith, quarterback 23 on this list, 128 to 192. Noah Fant, the tight end. And then Sam Howell, another quarterback, backing up Geno Smith that might get the job, that was decent enough for Washington for a little bit. So the question here, Joe, is that, again, using a third round pick on a player that's tied to the 23rd best quarterback, like we said, we have a problem.
Well, there's a giant difference between this low-rated quarterback and Daniel Jones, though.
I'm getting to my point here, though, is that, we talked a little bit about Russell Wilson in previous week and Justin Fields and how maybe George Pickens isn't someone that I covet in this year's draft. Can you make a case? Can you make a case for DK Metcalf as a third-round wide receiver, or would you rather wait the bit? And I'm thinking that you would, to take a guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba all the way down there at wide receiver 40, potentially in the 5th or 6th rounds of your draft. So make a case for me where it makes sense to take DK Metcalf, and then make a case for me where you'd rather wait for Jackson Smith.
Okay, so the argument for Metcalf goes like this. He was the highest percentage of targets of his team last year. And literally the analysis of Metcalf has to hinge on that fact. Do you think that they are going to keep chucking him the ball that inordinate percentage of the time? Because at the end of the day, it's a volume league. And it's a volume game. If you get more balls thrown at your receivers, 9 times out of 10, you win. And Metcalf has an exorbitantly high amount. We look at players that, quite frankly, get targeted more than 160 times. They're all the top 5 receivers in fantasy football. But Metcalf's back in the 3rd round. So your question is this going to continue? Like, we know CeeDee Lamb is going to get targeted over 160 times.
Oh, yeah.
Dallas doesn't have a choice. Metcalf, on the other hand, did this last year when essentially Tyler Lockett fell off the face of the earth, and then Jigba was a rookie. So when we look at this and say, the question that would hold Metcalf back is actually, does Njigba step up and become a number one threat to taking the ball off of it.
So here's an
And
interesting
that
fact,
is
Joe.
the argument for both of them.
I don't
It's
want
do you think Metcalf keeps getting that target share?
I don't want to throw you off your jive or anything, but just an interesting fact in terms of not targets but actual receptions last year. DK is sitting here, and I believe that DK did have some injury concerns last year.
He also had some catching concerns last year.
Let me look that up. So no, he played in 16 games last year. 16 games. So when we look at DK was targeted 119 times.
It's a team that didn't throw the ball a lot.
With 66 receptions, which is,
under 66%.
Not a great clip. Coming over to Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett had more receptions than DK Metcalf, and was targeted 122 times. And Jackson Smith is sitting here, rookie wide receiver coming out of the woodwork last year. Everybody knows that he's doing pretty well. Comes out and gets targeted 93 times and catches 63 balls. So his target share, those target shares are really, really close together.
If you do season long,
wasn't catching.
Where it changed, and I appreciate you bring that up. That's the season long numbers.
Yes.
After Thanksgiving, Seattle really kind of Metcalfed out. He was hurt. He played, but he didn't really play full games after Thanksgiving. So a lot of that is injury adjusted numbering. But nonetheless, it still gets to the point where Lockett is on the decline. He's literally aged out of the league. Despite the fact that he's still there, he is certainly the most projectable, declinable player from last year's production to this year. And I do think that the Jigba, because their styles of game are more likely to take that.
So wait, hold on.
The bigger issue is Seattle doesn't throw the ball enough because they don't complete enough passes.
Did you say after Thanksgiving? Because statistically speaking, after Thanksgiving, he had his two best games of 20.
Metcalf or Jigba?
Metcalf. Metcalf had a game 11:30. 6 receptions for 134 yards against Dallas, and then
that's the week after Thanksgiving.
And then on Christmas Eve or on New Year's Eve, he went off for 5 receptions for 106 yards, and there were 2 games in there with 50. Oh, and then the game on after Thanksgiving, he had 3 touchdowns. So that was arguably
his best game of the year. I mixed up the week then, yeah.
But he did from week 4 to week 8 really didn't provide you with much, and then in week 11 didn't really do anything anyway. So the point is taken that this is an interesting wide receiver room.
When he's out there, they throw him the ball like crazy. Is the point?
Now couple that in with a new coach, new offensive coordinator. These are all things to consider. So
well, here's the bigger issue. When we're looking specifically at DK,
I want you to make a case.
And this is where I believe this comes to the bigger play.
I want you to make the case where he is that I should draft him in the 3rd round. That's what I want you to do. And you're not yet telling me that that's what I should do.
Why you should draft Metcalf?
But I want you to give me a case that why DK Metcalf is worth a 3rd round pick.
Bob, I don't think he is. You're asking me to lie.
I want you to try to tell me.
So the case is this. This is the argument you have, is that 2 things have to happen to make Metcalf worth a top 3 round receiver. Thing number 1, Seattle overall has to get much more first downs to convert the ball better. That's part of why they changed their coaching staffs. So the belief is that they're doing that. The number 2 thing, which I believe is much more projectable, is Lockett needs to continue to decline and them not really having a 3rd option, which they kind of don't. Noah Fant's not really a 3rd ball catcher. You look at their 2nd tier of receivers. They have Exridge, I believe that's how you say his name.
Oh, Eskridge, yeah.
He was a second-round pick from 3 years ago. Maybe he's able to step up and do this. But at the end of the day, if he really was the dude, you never would have drafted Njigba in the first place. This is one of the things where teams tell you what they think about people. So I look at this and say, if you want to have Metcalf produce the season of Metcalf being amazing and awesome, this team would have to rely upon the passing game from the running game, which you can make the argument switching coordinators, switching coaches is likely. Carroll was a big runner. Okay, so you can see that. But the bigger issue is he has to start bringing in greater than 60% of the balls thrown his way, him being Metcalf specifically right now. And that didn't happen. Now, here's where this is going to really go full circle is when Geno Smith has had genuine camp competition and he's actually won the job, he has always had the best 2 months of his career. He did it 2 years ago. Last year, he was an incumbent, lame duck, no challenge, horrible all year. Every time throughout his career where he has won a job in training camp, when there's been a legitimate competition for the starting job, he has come out on fire. When he needs to win a competition, he blows it away so that people don't question it until the next offseason. So that would imply that you're going to complete more passes. You're going to have Metcalf's capability. Overall, though, I still, and again, this is why that's why you can justify him as a third-round pick. Your starting question was, based upon their values, a 6th-round Njigba or a 3rd-round Metcalf, who would I rather have? It's the Njigba all day. And the reason for this is, first off, as we sit here this moment in time in 2024, Njigba's a more talented football player. And when you have a new coaching staff that is starting from scratch, the first thing they look at is who are the best players on the field? Njigba. So when you look at that and go, okay, I mean, it's not like it's a mile apart like it would be at a team like the Giants that we just talked about, but it's a 1 and then a solid 1B. And then there's big distance until you get to lock it in the 3-hole. So I get a chance to be a massive target share, almost guaranteed over 120 targets a year, which is what the Njigba will get. I'm going to be in a system where I believe the passing yardage is going to be better. And by the way, because he's not Metcalf, he doesn't have the name recognition, he's not getting double teamed nearly as much. So you already saw last year he brought in a bigger percentage of his target share in terms of catching the ball. I see that to continue. I see his total target share to continue. And I think that Njigba has a very good chance of out-kicking that 6th-round cost that you're going to put on him. He's right now, he's at the end of the 6th-round, 7th-round type guy. And I think that you paint this picture, you can justify a late 4th or a 5th round on him, but I cannot justify a 2nd-round pick on Metcalf when we're talking about drafting someone around early. So that's why the selection for me would be 3rd round. Personally, I don't go receiver in 3rd round anyway. But I wouldn't want Metcalf to be my number 1 because it goes back to something that you said before. I want to have the consistency as my number 1. Okay. And overall, then Njigba doesn't get hurt nearly as much. He catches the ball better. And I just believe he's going to be a more reliable target.
Now,
it's also the closer, easier catches on the field as well.
So for everybody joining us, we're building off a discussion that we had last week, and we started at the beginning of the episode, and going through a couple of teams that, we maybe didn't do enough to improve some fantasy stock. So it's pretty much status quo. Things that are diamonds in the rough, things that, we should be looking for and concerned about heading into this year's fantasy football season. Now,
and if you guys are watching us on X and you want to submit your people, you cannot direct tweet us. You have to go into the broadcast page.
I want to bring up, Joe, and this is a mock draft created by ESPN. The ESPN analysts come together. This is a 10-team PPR mock draft. And I want to go to the point of Jackson Smith and Njigba versus DK Metcalf. So in this draft, DK Metcalf basically leads off the beginning of the 4th round at pick 32. I want to read to you a couple wide receivers that you'd have the decision on, according to the ESPN analysts at this point in time, to discuss. There's a couple.
I cannot wait till best ball league so we can do this ourselves.
There's a couple things to think about that maybe are off-putting in this listing of rankings, but again, so popping off at the beginning of the third round, leading off Drake London. Would you rather have Drake London or DK Metcalf?
London.
Okay. Leading off, and then pick 22, Michael Pittman or DK Metcalf?
Pittman.
Marvin Harrison or DK Metcalf?
Ooh. I'm in love with Marvin Harrison, but I'd probably go Metcalf.
Mike Evans or DK Metcalf?
Metcalf.
Nico Collins or DK Metcalf?
Collins.
And then DK goes at 32, but other wide receivers to choose from in at least their draft. Again, this is ESPN's 10-team mock draft. Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel going 35-36.
Ayuk, not Samuel.
Okay. And then Stephon Diggs and Devonta Smith. Going pick 39.
I pick Metcalf over Diggs, but not Smith.
Out of that list of wide receivers that I just said to you, what would make you feel comfortable if you ended up picking DK Metcalf and you were to take another one of those wide receivers? Would you feel comfortable with that, taking two in this third, fourth round range?
So, like, if I was on the turn there and I got Collins and Metcalf, I'd be loving that. I'd be great with that. If I go running back, and then two receivers on that turn, take that all day.
Okay. Now, coming down to where Jackson Smith and Jigba got drafted in this mock draft. Jackson Smith got drafted pick number 96. The guys that I think are off in this, I'm not sure why they're this. I know why I guess there could be this low. But Amari Cooper was taken at pick 98, which I think he'll be taken much higher.
Well, he is the secretly worst quarterback in the league that no one wants to talk about.
And DeAndre Hopkins was taken at pick 97, and I think he'll be taken a lot higher in most drafts. So we're not going to consider them in this conversation.
I would take Jigba before Hopkins, though. I absolutely would.
That's what happened here. But again, looking at wide receivers in this range, we have Jaden Reed being taken at pick 81, Christian Watson being taken at pick 82.
I'd rather have the Jigga over Watson.
Jordan Addison taken at pick 87.
And Jigba.
Christian Kirk at pick 92. Marquise Brown at pick 95 and Jackson Smith at pick 96. So I'm going to name a couple other
Jigba over Smith.
I'm going to name a couple other players that aren't wide receivers that you could potentially think about in this round to consider value as well. Nick Chubb.
No. Nick Chubb's a landmine. I don't want him at all this year.
Tajay Spears.
I love Spears.
Najee.
I think Najee's going to have a huge year too.
I'm going
to be overtracting him. I already know I'm going to be doing that.
Gus Edwards.
I don't want the Gus bus. I'd rather have Njigba for sure.
So it feels like Njigba is the guy in this 8, 9, 10 round, because even in round 8, wide receivers that are popping out, at least in this mock draft, again, we're looking at an ESPN mock draft, 10-team PPR league with all of the analysts that was produced.
Hey, can you just give me a point of reference that they're completely unsimilar players? Where did Mike Evans go?
Oh, he went in the third round.
That's way too high for Mike Evans.
He went pick number 24, wide receiver 14.
Sorry, I said Mike Evans, and in my head, the one who's the Jet from San Diego. I said the wrong Mike.
Mike Williams.
Yes.
Okay, I'll look that up for you. Mike Williams went pick number 128 in this draft.
So 12th round, okay.
13th round. It's a 10-teamer.
Okay.
So we're looking here, and
there might be value in there.
We might
have a Jets chat.
Going back to Jackson Smith. So I'm going to read you off the team. So this is Mike Clay's team, drafted in a 10-team PPR. This is his team, which I think some of these players you will get behind, and it could be pretty interesting. Jordan Love, QB1. Justin Herbert, QB2. Breece Hall.
2-quarterback league?
I'm assuming. But I'm assuming it's not a 2-quarterback league because they would have went higher. Breece Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs, 1-2 running back. Rashad White, Tajay Spears, running back 3 and running back 4. Chuba Hubbard, running back 5. Debo, Waddle, Rishi Rice, Jackson Smith, Rome Odunze, Trey McBride, Jake Ferguson, Evan McPherson, New York Jets.
Did like half of the ESPN writers just punt on their teams? Because that team is more stacked than a 10-man.
Now, hold on. Okay, so here's the team that drafted DK Metcalf. Now, granted, you got to take all of this with a grain of salt because the ESPN analysts know each other and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But QB1, Joe Burrow. QB2, Caleb Williams. Running back 1, Saquon Barkley. Running back 2, Joe Mixon. Running back 3, DeAndre Swift. Running back 4, Najee Harris. Running back 5, Trey Benson. Wide receivers in order: Puka, DK, Malik Neighbors, Christian Kirk, Tyler Lockett, Jerry Jeudy, Njoku, Tucker, and the Chiefs. The reason I bring this up.
This is the kind of team that you get mad at for telling your uncle how bad he drafted.
The reason I bring this up is because DK Metcalf could lull you into a false sense of security and make you want to take more risks at picks where maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't take the risk at Malik Neighbors in round 5. Maybe you shouldn't go after a quarterback in round 6 like they did. And maybe DeAndre Swift isn't the best pick at 7 because you haven't absolutely secured yourself a team that is interesting. Whereas if you don't take the risk on a guy like DK Metcalf for security standpoints, even though he has produced in the past, you definitely will walk out of your draft with potentially a different team. So along with what you were saying, Joe, is that DK Metcalf, potentially a landmine for the sheer fact that you think you might be getting one thing, your security blanket of, oh, he's a high volume kind of guy might not be there. And you might take risks too early. Whereas if you just sat back on DK Metcalf, took a guy that maybe is a little bit more solid, that it will allow you to take quiet risks a little bit later. And taking both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, it is not the year to do that anymore. So Seattle provides for an interesting experience when we think about players. Again, if you're watching, feel free to talk to us about a team or a player that you want us to discuss.
And if you are on X, you have to do it in the actual broadcast page. You cannot do it through tweeting us directly.
So, Joe, when we think about teams that maybe we haven't touched on a lot, but will potentially have value in players, we haven't really talked about Miami that much either. And
let's go.
Miami, for their credit, was a very good team last year. And the changes that they needed to make are on the defensive side of the ball, getting healthy, getting a complete complement of players. They went out there and started to do that. So, but the thing about Miami is that, going to our Fantasy Pros list here, is that your first Miami player coming off the board is obviously Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
And he's popping off at wide receiver 2 overall, number 3.
Yeah.
Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 19, ranked 33. Devin Achane, running back 13. When we go to the ESPN model here for the draft.
Yeah, I mean, Miami's an expensive team. I mean, there's no way around this.
We come and look at Miami. Tyreek goes 3 overall. Devin Achane goes 33rd overall, round 4, running back 15, right after DK Metcalf. Jalen Waddle comes out at round 5, an interesting round, to say the very least. Mostert, round 11. And then Tua, did he even get drafted?
Of this whole group, Tua is going to be the most valuable.
Tua did not land on a team.
Yeah.
So
let's break this down here.
talk to us about
it. Look at Miami as a whole, first off. This is a fact that happened, and I promise as I say this, I'm not a Jets fan. The Miami Dolphins obviously started off on fire. They had extra home games in Florida when it was hot as hell. Teams weren't able to handle it. But guess what? Right about Halloween, a little bit after it, the smartest man in the NFL got figured out. And this points per game plummeted. Yes, some people are going to say it was injury related. We started having Mostert and A-Chain bouncing in and out of the lineup. Schematically, there were not the openings there were in the beginning of the season. So if you want to go the Miami route, which I do not recommend for the first round pick to do this play, but it is a viable option. And that is this. Take any of them. A-Chain probably being the best example. With the expectation you are going to trade them. Mm-hmm. You're going to ride them through a hot September and then move them. And the reason for that is they are going to have so much sizzle, so much heat in the beginning of the year, and they're going to win you games. And don't get me wrong, I totally understand a win in September is as valuable in fantasy football as a win in November.
Absolutely.
That's true. But these Miami core, I do not believe will be able to carry you to win a championship. But they can be as sizzling and sexy in the beginning of the year that you can then turn into assets that will be growing for the second half of the year. This is a very, very more talented version of the Amari Cooper argument. And there is talent in doing this. You get A-Chain in the second round. He's tearing the ball off the cover. And then you go around mid-October and you go, you know what? I'll go take Josh Jacobs and your number 2 receiver. Boom. I can win a championship with that haul in return. Mm-hmm. So this is the strategy I want to implement for all of Miami players up front. Because 2 things I do believe are going to happen. One of which I can guarantee. First is it's not going to stay a million degrees in Miami all season long, and the players will cool down as a result. And second, I do believe the league will figure out Daniels again for whatever adjustments he made. Because he really didn't have after he went on Hard Knocks. He was too busy being the pretty boy of the show. So when I look at this, I think they are great options as long as you know I want to trade them. And this is why I'm cold on Tyreek. Because you cannot get the return for trading the number 3 pick overall. You just can't.
I want
second rounders, sure. Waddle, absolutely. Tyreek, no.
First of all,
well knowing if you play him the first 3 weeks of the year, you're going to lose to him. You
first
accept
of all,
that.
A correction. You don't have to take Devin A-Chain in the second round. There's probably going to be somebody out there who's going to be convinced to do that, but most likely he's going to be your third, fourth round guy. You know, he has. I think that the value for him, you know, people who didn't draft running backs.
That's because there's still a conceived debate that Mostert might play.
Well,
A-Chain's taking this job universally before camp's over.
I'm more so what I'm saying here, Joe, is that the debate in your mind is how your draft has circled out to that point. Is that if in the third round there are the wide receivers are there, but you've already taken 2 and you want a running back, you know, you're deciding between Rashad White, James Cook, Devin A-Chain. You're going to have to decide what you feel is better. So something more.
Well, let me ask this question a different way, Bob. If Mostert was not on that roster, how much more valuable would A-Chain be? He would be, in my mind, he'd be right next to Bijan.
Disagree, but I think that he'd be closer to Jahmyr Gibbs. I think that
we're fighting between 2 backs at this point.
But again, different.
That's still early second round territory.
So,
and I honestly believe by the time camp comes around, Mostert will have definitively lost the job.
Getting rid of Mostert for as a team perspective.
And it's not that Miami's going to cut Mostert. They're not. It's just that he's not going to be the starter anymore.
But here's the thing. So Devin A-Chain, if we learn about Devin A-Chain's, you know, how much he's going to control, and again, this all depends on how Miami's playing. If Miami's playing with a lead, he's absolutely electric. And he put up that 53-point game and everybody was, stars and garters about him. But you look at him and you say, okay, well, Kyron Williams, they got a running back in the draft. Kyron's still the guy. Isaiah Pacheco, still the guy. Jahmyr Gibbs, definitely the guy. Travis Etienne, definitely the guy. Derrick Henry, definitely the guy. These are all guys that are probably you're talking about in this decision making. Now, Devin Achane or Derrick Henry, that's a good decision. I mean, I'd still take Derrick Henry, but Derrick Henry's boom weeks have gone downhill recently. Again, different team, new style, new system, but it's still, would I rather take explosion? Would I rather, is my team built for that? Now, when we talk about Devin Achane, he's floating between the second and fourth round, and that seems to be fair value for a running back of his caliber. Now, the thing comes in is that how he slips into the third round is if you don't like Joe Mixon on a crowded offense, if you don't like James Cook on an offense with minimal wide receiver help, if you don't like Rashad White on almost the same offense, retreading the pathway here, Devin Achane is going to climb up into the third round. And, realistically, he's competing in most people's minds, I would bet, as the Travis Etienne, Derrick Henry, Devin Achane kind of thing, a player who can offer me 3 touchdowns and offer me, a good amount of yards if the game circles their way. So that's kind of where I'm falling at there. But again,
and season long, Bob, I completely agree with you. But for the first 6 games of the year, Achane's going to blow them all out of the water.
Oh, yeah, and that's fair. And
that's my argument. That's why you're going to have this high value to move them at.
And we saw this with Zach Moss when JTT got hurt last year. If you had drafted Zach Moss or you had picked Zach Moss up during that 3-4 week interim that JTT wasn't there, Zach Moss won you weeks.
Yes, he did.
He was that proficient, efficient, and good. And they gave him the ball. And he won you weeks. And you were playing him as a flex, unless you had JTT. You were playing him as a running back 3, running back 2. And, he was winning people weeks. He won me a bunch. He got me past the slumps that I had with some injuries with Saquon. And I was able to come back from that. Now, the debate comes here with Tyreek Hill, and to anybody who's watching still right now, we're talking a little bit about players and their values leading up into this year's draft. We talked about the Giants earlier. We talked about the Seattle Seahawks. Now we're talking about the Miami Dolphins. Now with Tyreek Hill, to your point, Tyreek Hill is an incredible, explosive value. Absolutely one of the most electric playmakers on the field at any one point in time that he's on the field. Taking him at wide receiver 3, he was going for the record last year. Taking him at wide receiver 3, or at position 3, wide receiver 2. We're talking CD, Tyreek, Jamar, and then talking a little bit about Justin Jefferson and Amon-Ra. Now, I got to ask you, Joe, is there a situation here? Say you're sitting at 3 and your league allows trades. Would you consider trading down in the first round to potentially take...
We're assuming it was McCaffrey and Lamb, 1-2?
Yes.
Okay.
Trading down in the first round, maybe a pick or 3, dropping down to maybe potentially take Breece Hall and Bijan and get a couple picks in some later rounds, maybe an extra 4th. Hold on. Not ready. No, almost there. Or do you draft Tyreek Hill at value and then trade him? Because in our leagues, stuff like that happens all the time. We take a guy like Patrick Mahomes. Another person takes Saquon Barkley. We don't like the way our teams look, so we swap players and get additional auction league money or draft capital. What, to you, sitting tight on Tyreek Hill isn't terrible. It's a really, great.
This is knowing your league at the end of the day.
So what do you do? What would you do in that scenario?
Well, knowing the league mates I have, they will not value the hypothetical as much as seeing the results on the field. So it's kind of contrary to what I said in the beginning. But I would rather have Tyreek, have him scorch a couple people during September, and then I'll get what I believe would be more for him. Because if I tried to do a trade of 3 down, it would basically be swapping first and second picks, and then maybe I would make up some back end of like the 4th round. Mm-hmm. That's not worth it as much as what I'd get is if I had Tyreek. He won September for me by himself.
I mean, he can get you 30. He could get you 30, 40 points. I mean,
each week in September, I trade him when he's still relatively hot, and then all of a sudden, boom. This is why I think that going back to it, you just referenced that ESPN league you're doing here, 10-man league.
Well, most ESPN, of them dropped. I'm reading. I'm not doing it.
Most of them drafted 2 quarterbacks. Tua didn't go. Tua to me is the value of all of the Miami teams.
It's kind of absurd.
Because you'll be able to turn him into knowing if Burrow's healthy, into Burrow when Burrow is doing his stretch run, winning games by himself. And that's the thing. You basically get the upside of knowing you're going to trade for Burrow or a Burrow equivalent without having to deal with the first half of the season. Is he going to be hurt?
Now,
true with Dak, true with Burrow, whichever one you want to get. Did Cousins recover?
Yeah, so I want to bring this up too, Joe, is that, this ESPN...
Miami's a great team to do this with.
This ESPN mock draft that came out 6 days ago, again, with the analysts, some teams took 1 quarterback, some teams took 2 quarterbacks. So...
All right, we'll say half and half. So he'd be the 16th quarterback in their mind.
Right now in Fantasy Pros, Tua ranks as the 12th rated quarterback on their list, and he's going to get drafted in 12-team leagues. And I think fair enough that, he's earned the right at this point in time through his production that we've seen on the field to be a very, very relevant back end their starter on fantasy teams, if not an every week starter for the beginning of the season.
I think he can win you a lot of leagues. I got him right there with Lawrence.
I think if I were to take a quarterback, and just going through these rankings here, Joe, of quarterbacks in terms of Fantasy Pros information here, we have Tua at 12, Herbert at 13, Caleb at 14, Brock Purdy at 11, Jordan Love at 10. The only guy that I would want out of those over Tua would be Jordan Love. So if I could get Tua a little bit later, but what I fear of a guy like Tua of Tua's caliber is that during this time, this is the Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, Tua, Justin Herbert, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, and Trevor Lawrence. There is going to be a mini run.
Yeah, because they're all basically the same.
Yeah, there's going to be a mini run for those in your league that didn't go. And there's probably going to be a pact out there between the guys and gals in your league that if you didn't get one of the top 5, and Anthony, I'm going to group Anthony Richardson, Joe Burrow, and Dak in this too. If you didn't get one of the top 5, you basically look at these players and say, well, what do I want? Anthony Richardson could be electric. Joe Burrow, we already know he's good. Dak Prescott, what kind of year is he going to have? Probably another very good one. Kyler Murray, fairly electric in his own right. Jordan Love, young, upcoming superstar. Brock Purdy, consistent. Tua, explosive. Justin Herbert, good veteran with not so great weapons right now.
That's the problem over there.
So those guys are going to be, there's going to be a run, and you've got to make a decision. And we talked with our viewer Tamsin last week about runs, and you got to make a decision if you want to participate in that run or not, or wait it out.
See, I don't, because there's so many names there that are basically the same. It's like tight ends.
It's the same, but somebody's going to get scared. And the thing is that Tua is probably going to be the odd man out in this situation.
I'm okay with that.
Because Kyler's got a lot of, we've seen Kyler be superstar. We've seen Dak do it. We've seen Joe B do it. We know that Anthony Richardson has the potential to do it. And we saw Jordan Love last year. So Purdy and Tua, out of that grouping, they're ranked 11th and 12th, and that's fair because what they're going to provide, there's a lot of questions in terms of sustained production. And when it comes down to it, Tua's probably going to be your quarterback in a 2-quarterback league that is going to be matchup dependent at some point in the year, where you're going to be maybe flexing him and Trevor Lawrence between the two. Maybe you take an Aaron Rodgers and a Tua. Why I bring this up, Joe, is that going after a guy like Tua might be indicative to you that almost within the next 2 or 3 rounds, saying to yourself, I might need to go out there and get another quarterback. And
that's the part I disagree with. The only other one I would pair them up with would be as if I want to take a floater on a running quarterback, namely Fields. Because if Fields becomes the starter in Pittsburgh, he's going to be a league winner. But if it's a 1-quarterback league, which most leagues are, any of that group, I'm not taking a second quarterback with, because playing the game of quarterback roulette, trying to figure it out, ends up being a waste of a roster spot. Mm-hmm. You know the league is designed to protect quarterbacks. I brought it up.
Yeah.
So I would rather, again, Fields being the exception, but that's mostly as a stash play. I would rather roll the dice on a late round receiver, someone's backup running back, and just, hope that pans out on a play. That's how I would rather play that, because the likelihood of Tua getting hurt and me not being able to go get a similar-ish style quality quarterback on the waiver wire is not existent. I'm going to be able to do that every day in a 1-quarterback league. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually talking myself into making the argument that quarterback should be one of my last 4 picks. 2 quarterbacks, a defense, and a kicker. I'm thinking that that's an argument. And like I said, unless you go the Fields route.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
I said that wrong. A quarterback, 2 defenses, and a kicker. Because I do believe in having 2 defenses.
Let me ask you this. Player comparison. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm going to name you 3 players that are all within the same weight.
Who am I comparing them to?
Hold on.
Am I comparing them to Tua?
No. Well, yes, but I'm comparing round. Okay? Round and player value. So knowing that Tua didn't get taken, but that he's probably going to normalize somewhere in between the 8th and 10th round of fantasy drafts.
Feels high, but okay.
Somewhere in there. I'm looking at ESPN's mock draft, and I'm looking at Fantasy Pros rankings, and an interesting discussion point, including players that we talked about last week and this week. Would you rather have Tua? So again, 9th round, going in the 9th round. Would you rather have Tua, Jaylen Warren, or Jackson Smith and Jigba? And what team construction standpoint would lead you to be taking each of those 3 players?
Well, I'd rather have a Jigba because he's, I believe, going to give me the most points relative to the positional value. Because I think, as I said earlier, I think the Jigba is one of these guys who can go off. I really do. I'm big on the Jigba this year. Warren, the argument for there is what I was saying before. He has the chance of being the true number 1 on a team. He's arguably more talented than Metcalf. And it's a team that, quite frankly, is in transition, going to be throwing the ball more than last year. I think the Seattle passing core is in a better spot, and he's undervalued. So I do think that he's undervalued there. Warren is now a very interesting selection. When you look at the Steelers from what they're doing based upon their actions, they chose not to give the extension to Najee. Mm-hmm. They went out and drafted 2 offensive linemen in their first 2 picks. And Warren is already the pass catcher in a team that doesn't really look like it has a number 2 receiver right now. So you can make a pretty good argument that in terms of weaponry, Warren is going to get a lot of usage relative to where you're going to get the other running backs there. And you can make an argument that he might be the second best, or maybe even the best, second best, second running back on his team behind A-Chain. You can make a very good argument that that's Warren. And that being said, okay, because he's infinitely better than Tony Pollard. So you can make this argument saying, okay, there's going to be some value there. He's going to get his chance to be electric. Quite frankly, when the Steelers' offense was good last year, it was through Warren. So, not saying it happened a lot, but when it did, it was through Warren. So that's the argument for Warren, is that he has the potential, probably never as a volume guy, but as a kind of A-Chain light type deal. And
we just talked about Tua and your thoughts there. So tell us
what this is positional value for me. At the end of the day, I am talking myself into that unless I get Fields, because I think he might be the only exception, because Fields to me, if he does play, regardless of when he comes in, we'll know this better after the schedule comes in, because the Steelers have like a week 9 schedule. That would be the shift. But if Fields does play, you can get a top 5 quarterback super late. There's a ton of value in that. However, and then I look at that entire grouping of quarterbacks, basically 5 through 18. I treat them a lot like tight ends. Sure, I have personal favorites, but if I end up with Tua or I end up with Purdy, I don't really care. I get to stack my team with other high-end explosive targets, because to me, there's only a couple quarterbacks that are going to blow up and be league-changing. 3 of them we know, obviously. Mahomes, Allen, Hurts. Stroud, to me, is in that list. And maybe Murray. I don't think Lamar's going to go off, and I don't think Richardson's going to go off. But the rest of them, I don't really see a difference between Burrow, Herbert, or Tua.
So I'd like to. So knowing
I have rankings, but in terms of valuing my team build, whatever one I can get late, even if it's a Cousins or a Carr. I mean, Carr's certainly a tier below it, but even if it's Cousins, whatever.
So I asked you about team construction standpoint, and I just want to share the ESPN mock draft here. Again, ESPN mock draft, fantasy analysts, fantasy experts from 6 days ago did a 10-team mock draft that can be found on ESPN.com PPR. This is teamed up. QB, Jalen Hurts, round 5. Christian McCaffrey, running back 1, pick 1-1.
Which I agree with.
Running back 2, Jalen Warren, pick 8th round, 10th pick in the round.
Stack in the middle here.
Running back 3, Zach Charbonnet. Running back 4, Jerome Ford. Running back 5, Chase Brown. Potentially could be some value. Those picks were taken in the 11th.
Ford could be very good.
Those picks were taken in the 11th, 12th, and 13th round.
I like his end draft here.
It's worth a chance, but I'm not so sure that the right wide receivers were taken to be able to tell me that I want Jalen Warren as my second running back, and here's why. Chris Olave, 2nd round. Drake London, 1st pick in the 3rd round.
Live with that.
Devonta Smith, 4th round. Tank Dell, 6th round. Jaden Reed, 9th round. Then the duo of McConkey and Johnston in the 10th and the 14th round. Now,
see, the only thing I would have changed about that, instead of having the entire receiving core from 2 years draft, I would have gotten out and taken Laporta.
Yeah, they ended up taking Evan Ingram in round 7.
That would have been the difference there. I don't have a problem with that receiving core. This is the issue when you look at that Devontae Smith, you said Olave, and who's the other one?
London, Tank Dell, Jaden Reed.
All of them should be high volume guys. Absolutely. But with the exception of Olave, they're not really doing a whole lot after the catch. They're not super high ADOT guys. Smith should be if he gets back to where he was 2 years ago, but last year we weren't really seeing it. So I like that receiving core. I would have liked it a whole lot more if you would have thrown Laporta in there.
Now, Joe, the reason I brought it up isn't because I dislike it. It's because these guys are pretty much the same.
No, that's a very similar group. That's right.
And it would scare me on a week-to-week basis, knowing that I have technically Olave and London, who are the number one wide receiver on their team.
Oh,
But
without
again,
a doubt. I mean, neither one of them have a number 2 on their team.
But again, these are two teams that they were the number one wide receiver last year, again, in flux situations for certain teams, and it just didn't click. Now, Kirk Cousins hopefully will make it click for London. But we can't posit that that's going to happen, because what Kirk Cousins did with
is Derek Carr going to be in a boot the whole year?
Minnesota, yeah, again. Then you go off and you take 3 targets from what are hopefully going to be very high volume offenses, which is never a bad thing.
No, it's not.
With Philly, Houston, and Green Bay. Now, the problem that I have with this is walking into this wide receiver room. I'd be happy with walking out of it. But the problem is that you have slighted yourself so much at positional value at running back. Where
I mean, if you would have said Saquon as the 2nd round pick, and then the rest of that list of receivers while Olave, you love that team.
I get it. This is a PPR league, so you're probably playing both Dell and Reed in your flexes. But and you could play all those wide receivers. But there's the problem comes in for me is that they're all very much lottery style picks on high volume offenses. Is that I don't know if Devonta Smith, Tank Dell, or Jaden Reed, they performed adequately and very good for the most part for Jaden Reed last year, and Tank Dell very well last year when he was healthy. But with the addition of Diggs, crowded room in Green Bay, Devonta Smith didn't really show much of anything last year. It's a scary proposition, because
the problem with that team is you have 4 guys and only 3 spots, so you're going to be playing decision the whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and making the wrong decision is something that sticks with a lot of fantasy players.
Oh, it so does.
A lot of times where you had Devin A-Chain, but you sat him during the 53 point game. So then you start him every game that he's healthy. And you probably started him when he came back from his injury, and he
Mm-hmm.
didn't do anything for you because you had FOMO. And that's a very real possibility. And
it is.
And looking at this running back room, this is a very realistic team to make. But looking at this running back room, the Zach Charbonnet, the Jerome Ford, the Chase Brown, all have a little bit of upside there. But if Warren were to go and not perform at what we think Warren could do, or McCaffrey goes down, you have no one, and that's a 0, or at least very close to a 0 as you possibly can be. Now, we saw Jerome Ford show out.
Well, I can tell you, Ford's going to be on a lot of my teams. When we do our bets balls all summer long, where we're actually putting our money where our mouth is, Ford is going to be on a lot of my rosters for 2 reasons. A, I don't think Nick Chubb is going to be back. I know that healthy-wise, he would dress. I think he's going to be a shell of himself. And second, I think Watson's really a bad quarterback, a really bad quarterback, and they're going to try to hide him because they can't win games with Watson throwing the ball 45 times a game. They can't. So they're going to have to run it, and Ford is going to be this beneficiary of a very late round pick who's really the starter in disguise. I think he's this year Kareem Williams.
I disagree. And here's a little bit why I disagree with that, and why Ford is kind of a dangerous pick for me. I owned him last year in a couple leagues, picked him up off the waiver wire, and he absolutely has the opportunities. He absolutely had plenty of opportunities to be the performer last year. I want to bring up Week 9. This is a game where Cleveland won 27-0. Okay? 20 carries, 44 yards. You come back again, Week 11 against the Steelers. That was a win. 12 carries, 31 yards, and a touchdown. The guy maxed out when given opportunities. His The max out performance was week 2 at 106. That's probably when a lot of people were like, hey, this guy's real deal.
Well, you think Hines is the guy who's going to be doing this then?
Down. Week 10, he went off for 107 yards. But other than an 84-yard performance, everything was sub 80 the rest of the year. So 3 games where he popped off. And it's pretty much, other than the addition of Jerry Jeudy here, which could make a big change, it's pretty much the same team with Deshaun Watson at the helm. So the question...
Well, here, I want to finish this point, though, because I do believe teams tell you by their actions. Look at this room that Cleveland has built in the offseason. Ford is the incumbent, so he's listed as the 2. And maybe Ford doesn't own the job. But we look at some other receivers, or other running backs, rather, who are in this room who have always screwed us. Nakeem Hines and Devonta Foreman are both in that running back room.
Again, Foreman
that could be Foreman ends up being this guy I'm describing. Either way, any one of those 3 are a late round running back. Whichever one is going to get the job in Cleveland, it's too early to tell. But
right, and in best ball, that's fine. In best ball, that's fine. But if I'm rocking Jerome Ford as my 3rd running back,
no, I don't think you do that. That's too crazy.
Going into a redraft league, that is a very dangerous proposition.
It
now,
is.
Knowing Nick Chubb's health, there's a very good chance that Ford could be the guy. And like I said, he had games where he used the 17 carries, 20 carries that he had to do very good. Then there were games where he had a decent amount of carries and did very bad. And so the script here, is very much different. When Joe Flacco came in towards the end of the season, we really weren't talking about Jerome Ford at all. And in PPR leagues, he was going off for, 10 points, 6 points, 8 points when you needed them the most. And so I think in best ball, it's fair to say that Jerome Ford is okay to have as a running back 3, running back 4. But in redraft league, again, if you're just joining us, we're going through some fantasy football stats. I'm talking about player values. And right now we're specifically looking at an ESPN mock draft with the analyst that was put out 6 days ago, comparing it to Fantasy Pros and just sharing our thoughts. When I'm rocking Jerome Ford and Zach Charbonnet as my running back 3 and 4 in a redraft league, doesn't matter how good my wide receiver room is, I'm still concerned, because this is like the hero running back kind of mentality here, where you go out, you take Christian McCaffrey, you say, okay, I'm good. I don't need to take another running back, and I can fill up on wide receivers that are fairly good to very good to excellent wide receivers. And it's a fair enough strategy to use, but it depends on that right player combination. And I'm just not sure after Christian McCaffrey that a combination of Warren, Charbonnet, Ford, and Brown is going to be enough.
It's not.
Even if these wide receivers pop off on a week-to-week basis, get you 15, 20 points, I'm just not sure it's enough.
Yeah, I mean, because we basically hit upon the 2 problems with a build like that. First is you don't have enough starting roster spots to play them all. So therefore, your last starter you drafted way late after you've taken many backups in between. So that hurts your starting ability outright. And the second part being is that because they're all so similar, you're going to be playing matchup hoping, and you're going to be let down one week.
And here's the rub too, Joe, is that everybody knows you've got a stacked room. And so they're going to undercut your value if you try to trade, say, Devonta Smith.
Yeah, you put yourself in a spot where
you're going to have to trade Devonta Smith after his very best performance, and they're still going to undercut you. And now you have Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnson. You're like, oh, I'll take a chance on one of those guys. But they're never going to crack your starting lineup. And they have zero. And in terms of trade value, somebody will have to be very desperate to give you a very good running back for, Ladd McConkey or Quentin Johnson. It's just not. If you're playing it more close to the chest, looking for points on a week-to-week basis with occasional, spikes when necessary, that's not the style of team to build this year. But if you want to
style that wins,
it could be, but those aren't the right players for it.
Yeah, like I said,
the strategy works, but those aren't the right players for it.
It actually, to me, is proof that going for the mid-tier receivers to build your team around, there's nothing wrong with.
No,
You know,
there isn't.
like you said, every time I've done this where I go running back heavy early, almost always I feel better off about the team coming out of it because, again, just supply and demand. There's way more good receivers than there are good running backs. It's a fact of the league.
Okay, here, Joe, I'm going to give you a potential opposite. And I'm going to share my thoughts, and I want you to
I cannot wait till we do real best balls. I'm so excited about it.
So
it's going to schedule release, guys.
Let's imagine that Dopp didn't take Christian McCaffrey 1-1. Everybody would call him crazy, but let's imagine he didn't. And then he took CeeDee Lamb 1-1. Okay?
Which I also get.
Coming back around, he has CeeDee Lamb 1-1. And sitting there at his pick, because it's probably going to be shifted because of Christian McCaffrey, Yates, who was the next pick, would have taken Christian McCaffrey at 2 and might not have taken Derrick Henry at number 19 overall. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. Let's construct this team this way. So let's say I don't take Drake London there, and let's say I go CeeDee Lamb as my number 1 overall pick. Let's say I keep Olave. Still don't have a running back. Keep Olave. Coming down, my next pick is beginning of the 3rd round. I have 2 solid wide receivers. I don't even need to think about Drake London. I can go with potentially the best tight end on the board in Sam Laporta leading off the 3rd round. So now I've got
2 receivers and a tight end.
Lamb. I've got Olave. Let me write this down here so I can.
Lamb, Olave, and Laporta.
Okay, Lamb, Olave, and Laporta. Coming back around now, I'm sitting there and I go, maybe
What's the running back room look like?
Maybe the running back room is looking thin. Aaron Jones and Alvin Kamara just went.
Ooh.
Devonta Smith, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, all on the board. And I'm sitting there. DJ Moore's on the board. Jalen Waddle's on the board.
So there's no running backs on the board right now.
No running backs on the board, but I can have my pick of one of those quarterbacks or 2 of these wide receivers in Devonta Smith, Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore.
I would go with Mahomes and Smith.
So you go Mahomes and you go Smith. So right now you still have no running back. You're not sitting at.
But I filled in my flex spot. Now my next 2 spots have to be backs.
You're dealing with Patty Mahomes. You're dealing with CeeDee. You're dealing with Olave. You got Devonta Smith, okay? And you got Laporta. Still no running backs. You're like, okay, I'm okay.
Probably playing running back roulette for the next 4 picks, actually.
Okay. Now, coming back down, this is not looking great because Ramondre Stevenson and Kenny Walker just went.
Is Najee still on the board?
Najee's still on the board, but he's pretty low down on the board too. But I'm sitting here in round 6 and 7. Tank Dell is there. Ridley's there. Rishi Rice.
It doesn't matter. The way I built this team, I have to go 2 running backs.
DeAndre Swift is there as well. So let's say, and Brian Robinson. So let's say, I move up a little bit. Maybe I do take Tank Dell. So he's my 4th wide receiver. Say I take.
Well, I'm definitely going Najee with the other pick because I know he's of that group. He's the best one left.
And then throw in Najee as my first running back off the board.
See, I would have gone Najee and Swift there.
Okay. So let's say you go Najee and Swift, and that's a fair thing to do. Coming back around now in round 8, you're still left with this decision of Jalen Warren, Jaden Reed, but then Tajee Spears.
I'd go Reed and Spears.
So you take
Reed and Spears.
And you take Spears. So for everybody joining us, we're just kind of adjusting right now one of the mock drafts that came out. And this is the 1-1 pick coming out. Now, coming out in round 10, you have your choice of Zeke on Dallas.
No.
Dobbins on.
Well, so now I'm the best player available.
Again, I'm going through the best available. You got Ladd McConkey, Charbonnet, Mostert, Dobbins, Elliott, Odunze, Curtis Samuel, Sutton, Ty Chandler, Lockett, Jamison Williams. I think if I were to pick from that combination of players, and I was looking at this team, I might maybe keep the faith in Charbonnet potentially, but I might take a chance on Jamison Williams or Odunze, something like that.
Yeah, Charbonnet and Odunze would be how I would do that turn.
So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers. Okay. Mm-hmm. So back it up.
I also have Laporta and Mahomes.
Right. Backing it up, round 12 and 13, you can still take Jerome Ford.
Oh, this was the whole way to burn on Jerome Ford.
No. Listen, you can still take Jerome Ford, and if you wanted to, go out and get Blake Corum, Adam Thielen, Justin Herbert. And we're just taking it in regards to this
draft.
That
would be old man Thielen territory for me.
You're just taking it in regards to this draft, so then you're sitting here at Thielen.
Because I do think Thielen's another guy who's going to be in a very watered-down version of that conversation we had about the Miami guys earlier.
And then Joe,
big early, trade him hot.
Sitting here again, coming in, it's rounding out the draft.
Is Brandon Cook still on the board?
What?
Brandon Cook still on the board?
Let's see.
Because I would have taken him over Thielen.
Cooks wasn't drafted. So Cooks
so he was. All right.
Okay. So anyway, okay. We're not going to do the last couple rounds here.
No, we don't need to.
But I'm going to read you this team, and we're going to compare it to that team.
All right.
Okay. So, which team do you want first? Do you want the team
the one we just
drafted
made,
or the one we just picked? Okay.
The one we just made.
Patrick Mahomes, quarterback. CeeDee Lamb, starting wide receiver. Chris Olave, wide receiver 2. Devonta Smith, wide receiver 3. Jaden Reed, wide receiver 4. Odunze, wide receiver 5. Adam Thielen, wide receiver 6. Najee Harris, running back 1. Swift, running back 2. Tajay Spears, running back 3. Charbonnet, running back 4. Jerome Ford, running back 5. Sam Laporta, tight end. Versus.
See, I like that team, but I feel like a lot of things had to break perfectly for my running back not to get screwed. I was sweating a lot during that process.
You're sweating, but
totally breakable build by taking the quarterback and the tight end early.
Right, and you didn't have to. You had your.
I didn't have to, but I also felt like I didn't have a choice with the players that were gone off running back already.
Now you got Jalen Hurts as his starting roster would be Jalen Hurts, McCaffrey, Warren, Charbonnet, Ford, Brown, Olave, London, Smith, Dell, Reed, McConkey, Johnston, Evan Ingram. Now, all things same in the world here, it's very reasonable to consider that outside, when you compare these things here, if I can get Olave, Devonta Smith, and Reed, okay, and pair them with CeeDee Lamb is just as likely to pop off as McCaffrey is. And I get basically a similar quarterback in terms of rankings. And my running backs, I still get Ford and Charbonnet, but they're not my third and fourth running backs. They're sitting here as my fourth and fifth, pairing them with Spears, Swift, and Najee. You could have taken Brian Robinson too. But even if you didn't, Joe, say you didn't take Chris Olave, okay? Say you didn't take Olave. And again, if you're sticking with us, we're just kind of comparing.
So why don't take Olave and take like Saquon there?
No. We're going to assume. This is what we're going to assume. We're going to assume that we took CD number 1 overall, that the next person took Christian McCaffrey, so they're not taking another running back, okay, in the second round.
See, this is to get to your point here. Just made me a side point. This is why I believe McCaffrey has to be 1, because it's the positional value of the running back.
I'm there with you.
I might even make an argument that Breece Hall should be 2.
Okay. Notwithstanding going through this here. say I take CD number 1 overall, and the guy next takes Christian McCaffrey. Well, there's a very good chance that he's not going to pair him up with Derrick Henry and probably is going to take the next best wide receiver, as we saw Dob do in his draft. So let's say we do a start of CD and Derrick Henry. Fairly solid start, right? Then in the 3rd round, instead of taking Drake London, who would you rather have? Pittman, Harrison, or Evans?
Pittman.
Okay.
And a PPR league, I'd rather have Pittman.
So our start now is CD, Henry, Pittman. Not Laporta. So we have CD, Pittman, Henry. Coming back around now in round 4 and 5, we have, now I'm not so solid at wide receiver, so I'm not going to take the chance at quarterback in this regard. And I'm going to go, and I'm going to take, I might still take Devonta Smith, okay? And let's say, who would you rather have? Waddle, Moore, or Kupp?
Waddle.
Okay. So walking out of the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds, you've got CD, Pittman, Devonta Smith, Waddle, Henry. You're not thinking about another wide receiver for a while.
No, you're done now. See,
okay.
Again, Bob, this is where we get to this. Where you're talking about shopping at, it's great getting those big receiver sexy spots early. There's no running backs left to play, and the quarterback world is irrelevant.
We're about to get there, Joe. We're about to get there.
I'm sorry, I Tarantino'd this. I showed you the end.
In round 6 and 7, the guy that took Christian McCaffrey goes, hey, I need another running back. I'll take Ramondre Stevenson. So you're sitting here now with a selection of wide receivers and running backs that you might have to take a little bit early. But same regard, say I go Swift and Najee again. I could take Brian Robinson. I could take David Montgomery, but I'd take Swift and Najee. So my team is now CD, Pittman, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris. Then in the 8th round, I don't want to take Jalen Warren. Terry McLaurin already went. Jaden Reed is sitting there, and so is Najee Spears. So is Kyler Murray. So is Zach Moss and Jordan.
Well, I've said this a couple times. I believe that as we're doing this right now, Spears is so undervalued. And it's like cheap.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, let's get back into the players instead of just bouncing around
No, I'm not.
The hypotheticals of ESPN.
I just want to, there's the point here is that when we talk about draft strategy, Joe, is that number 1, number 2 overall position, you can go hero, but you can also create a balanced lineup. Notice, haven't taken a quarterback yet, haven't taken a tight end yet. And if I don't do that, now this team might not look as sexy, but if I'm looking at it from a player by player standpoint, there could potentially be super solid production out of every single person on my roster. I'm just going to read you the players. We're going to stop at this round, and I'm going to read you this team as it stands right now, noting that Tua has not gone yet. You're still looking at, let me see if Brock Purdy went. You're still looking at Brock Purdy still on the board. Big Trevor Lawrence still on the board. So here's your skill position players. You didn't draft a tight end or a quarterback yet. You're sitting here and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 picks. Okay. This is your team. CD, Pittman, Devonta Smith, Waddle, Reed.
2 main receivers. But yeah.
Okay. I found
Derrick Henry, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris, Tajay Spears. That, although similar decision making that you're going to have, but from a different positional value standpoint.
Yeah, my answer, Bob, is that's
very much so.
Receivers. You drafted more receivers than you had starting spots for, and that's my fundamental issue with the build.
And that's fine, because what this says is that there are, like you were saying earlier, there are value wide receivers in the lane of Waddle, Reed at their positional value, that it would make sense, right? It would make sense to go after a quarterback earlier. It would make sense to go after a tight end earlier. And it would make sense to push running back a little bit earlier, because while you go through this, you're at the similar decision-making standpoint. If you go and you take CD, that's great. That's fine. Then I would push in that second and third round standpoint, players of the caliber of Henry, Laporta, maybe Olave to just solidify it and then sit back a little bit. But if I go wide receiver too early, there could be value that you're missing out on at the position, because you took a lot of studs, and that's fine. But to your point, and to the point that we made a little bit earlier, is you don't want to crowd the room too much. But at the same point in time, how we were saying about Dobbs running backs, you don't want to be too thin. You don't want to crowd it. You don't want to be too thin. You want to be fairly balanced with a group of explosive players or just solid production as you go. And it's all, the reason for that exercise is it's not necessarily about positional value sometimes. It's about that player. It's about, how does that player fit on its team? How does that player fit on my team? So tie that with positional value, then it all starts to come together, and we start to see teams where it makes sense to take a quarterback like CJ Stroud in the 5th, 6th round, where it makes sense to take Sam Laporta or Travis Kelce in the back end of the 2nd, early 3rd round, if that's where you're sitting.
Yeah, no, I got you here, and you're totally right. But I want to get back to looking at the NFL teams now, and take it in a direction where we were kind of wrong on this team last year because of Baker Mayfield. And I specifically want to talk about Godwin here from the Tampa Bay Bucs, because for like the 10th year in a row, they're bringing back essentially the same skill position. And this year, literally the same skill core again. They're all a year older. Baker did carry 2 receivers last year, and arguably the passing game of White. But as we saw it, it really just became, let's give Mike Evans his historical Hall of Fame numbers, which is what happened. Godwin started getting dinged up a little bit more. And this question is specifically about Godwin.
Okay.
Do we want to look at this and say, hey, maybe that 3rd round receiver they got would be a decent sleeper, because Godwin keeps getting hurt. They really don't have a number 3 receiver on their roster. Or maybe this is when Cade Otton finally wakes up.
Well, I mean,
Cade was kind of complexing to me, but I think that we're safely saying that Baker Mayfield's, like it or not, a top 20 quarterback in this league right now. So we have to look at his receiving core.
Yeah, you do have to look at this wide receiver core. And I think that right now, and last year, Mike Evans, again, we were down on the Tampa Bay Bucs last year a lot.
God's Mayfield.
And it was because we weren't sure what kind of production Mayfield would throw out there. And we didn't know if the smoke screen of Kyle Trask was a legit thing. So coming out of that, you're now sitting at a season that Baker Mayfield supported 2 very, very high production years in terms of yardage for his wide receivers, or for his wide receiver pool. But looking at Chris Godwin, now Chris Godwin had the yards, had more receptions than DK Metcalf, but only 2 touchdowns. And so you look at it and you say, is there room to snake a couple more touchdowns in there? But here's the rub, Joe, is that Chris Godwin has always been, in at least 4 of his seasons, when not injured, been the yardage guy, has been a yardage guy. In his tenure as a Tampa Bay wide receiver. He has
can I just ask this, like, because you're looking at the stats right now, Did he quietly become Keenan Allen?
Maybe. So here, let's break it down. Probably. Back in 2020, popped off for 7 touchdowns on 65 receptions in 12 games started. 2021, 98 receptions, 1,103 yards, 5 touchdowns, 14 games played. 2022, 104 receptions on 142 targets for 1,023 yards and 3 touchdowns. 2023 played the whole complement of the season, 83 receptions on 103 targets for 1,024 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now let me bring out Mike Evans so we can compare these two and then compare where they're going in the draft. Now again, this is last year, and then we're looking at this year.
Let me get near 100 catches. That should be a top 20 receiver.
Take into consideration the amount of information we're receiving. Now, Mike Evans, wily vet, came into the league 2015. Chris Godwin came in, or 2014. Chris Godwin came 2017.
Yeah.
Since
we don't need to do his whole career. Just do me last 3.
I'm going from 2020. So 70 receptions, 109 targets. 74 receptions, 114 targets. 77 receptions in 2022 with 127 targets. Now, touchdowns in both 2021 and 2020 were absurd. Tom Brady just chucking it, 14 and 13 touchdowns. Last year with Baker Mayfield, he got 13 touchdowns. 2022, he had 6. But receptions, 79 receptions, 136 targets. So is it fair to assume that it's a very good idea this year to own a Buccaneers wide receiver? I would say it's fair enough that would make sense.
Okay.
Now, if you look at where the values are at, I have to take Mike Evans as high as wide receiver 16 between pick 19 and most likely pick 30. So that is strictly in that 2nd to 3rd round.
I don't think I want to do that.
Range.
I mean, he is again, what, 33?
Again, you're taking Mike Evans at his highest maximum value because you're assuming that, yes, there's going to be a slight regression in terms of touchdowns, maybe goes down to 9. And that's fair enough to hit at your wide receiver 2, maybe your wide receiver 1, depending on how you've constructed your team up to that point. Now, Chris Godwin is coming off the board between pick 53 and 93 at wide receiver 35 in the same ilk as guys like Terry McLaurin, Tank Dell, George Pickens, players like Ramondre Stevenson, even guys like Aaron Jones potentially,
And of them, Godwin's the only one who really has a chance at 100 catches.
And Godwin realistically does have a chance at 100 catches. Now, the touchdowns are probably not going to be there. Maybe they go back up to 5 or 6 touchdowns. But on a week-by-week standpoint here, you're looking at him and you're saying, okay, I need that yardage and I need those points. Going into for last year though, Joe, it was a bit of a struggle for owners of Chris Godwin at certain points in time, maxing at 11, maxing at 9 points. But again, at the position that you're taking Chris Godwin, you're not taking him super high. I wanted to go back to that ESPN board here and just look where Chris Godwin is on where he went in their draft here. So Godwin is a player here that's definitely, like I said, wasn't on our radars last year, but realistically speaking, he's there this year because let's face it, at where he's being drafted, it's fair to say that he's going to eclipse expectations.
Yeah, I think so. That was why I brought him up.
And it's fair that if I'm looking at wide receivers, here we go.
And you said he nearly got 100 catches last year. How many games did he miss?
None.
There you go.
But again, That wasn't with Tom Brady. So,
That was with Mayfield.
that was with Mayfield. So Godwin,
Same system.
So Godwin in the ESPN draft went in round 6. And this is before guys, so right before a guy like Tank Dell, but after a couple rookies, after some rookie pop-off tight ends last year, after Kenny Walker, after Zay Flowers. And if I'm sitting at the top of round 6, I'm probably going to be very tempted to take Chris Godwin. And I might even be tempted to take him at the back half of round 5, not go after a guy like CJ Stroud, and maybe pair up a Chris Godwin with a Ken Walker, or a Chris Godwin with a Zay Flowers, or even, going a little crazy bananas, taking Chris Godwin, even if I'm in round 5 and a little bit earlier. The only 3 other guys popping off to me at wide receiver positions, Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore, and Waddle. I'd rather have Waddle, but I think that Chris Godwin is in that same discussion of player skill sets and how they're being used on the team. When we look at Waddle's stats last year, 72 receptions, 1,000 yards, 4 touchdowns. The year before, he went off for 8 touchdowns because of some injuries and some concerns and stuff there. So, I'm not writing it out of the realm of possibility that a Godwin and Waddle debate is going to cross my mind. Who's going to be more consistent as the year goes on is what I would question. What does the schedule look like? Is Tampa Bay going to be playing defenses that Godwin?
Tampa Bay has a below average, and it's an easier schedule. Is what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that.
Well, what I'm saying is that Godwin definitely feasts with certain defenses as opposed to other teams.
Let's be honest. There is no defense in the NFC South,
and the Dolphins are going to be playing higher caliber defenses to a degree.
Well, not to a degree. The AFC East is much better defenses.
And so the dilemma would come out: would I like Waddle or would I like Godwin?
But you also know that 2 is better than Mayfield.
But also, Joe, I could potentially get both. And while that's not
this is the other reason I wanted to bring up Godwin, because 2 weeks ago you were bringing up about how you don't want to take floaters that are high volatility guys with your first receiver off the board. And there were a couple of guys that you said that
I will say, with the exception of Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, that where they're going to give you solid production, but their booms are super, super high.
Yeah, but their floor is still high. But you were talking about
their floor is high. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's everybody.
So what I'm saying with Godwin is one of the last hitches in the draft where you can get consistency. You have at minimum 90 catches in your pocket before you even start. And you start going through that other list of guys. You ain't getting that from George Pickens. You ain't getting that from the other receivers you were talking about in that neighborhood. So Godwin is in a lot of ways a glue type that can help solidify volatility in your receiving room. And yeah, you don't always win by having a high floor, but you rarely lose if you have a couple of stables like that. He's, like, to me, right there in the ballpark of Pittman. Difference, 3 rounds. So who's the better value? By default, Godwin.
So to your point about George Pickens here, at the end of last season, Chris Godwin, George Pickens, and Zay Flowers all ended up within 2 points of one another. At sitting right there around 209 points. DK Metcalf was at 225 in a PPR league. Olave was at 231. Ayuk Debo also going high.
See, I'd rather have Godwin than Ayuk.
Now, but here's the thing: you can take Godwin. You can
Probably
take Godwin a couple rounds later than the Ayuk Debo Samuel debate that's happening. And it's pretty much very, very similar production, because while Ayuk went off for 7 touchdowns, there were a couple games where he was really garbage and didn't really do anything. He had a really good first game. Second game didn't really do anything. Then he had a game where he had 1 catch for like 50 yards and something like that. Kind of saved it with a touchdown towards the end of the game. But again, here's the other thing too, Joe.
But I also want to throw this out here. I am really liking stashing at the very end that Jalen McMillan pick, though.
Okay, so I wanna bring this
I'm gonna
up.
throw him up here
because it's a player that you like. Michael Pittman last year in a season shortened by with the Mississippi mud flap, he went off for 109 receptions on 156 targets for 1,152 yards and only 4 touchdowns to end the season at 260 points. Now, when I come and I look at Chris Godwin, is the potential there? I ask myself, is the potential there to go from 83 to 100? And the answer is absolutely, unequivocally yes. Mm-hmm. The opportunities there, knowing what we know about Baker Mayfield right now in his career, as opposed to what we kind of were walking into last year, is that he's set, he's comfortable. While he might not be the quarterback that is lights out, he's not concerned about turning the ball over, but this is a benefit to his wide receivers. And I'm sitting here looking at it, Joe, and, we go to Mike Evans. Mike Evans only had 79 receptions, and he's bolstered by that 13 touchdowns. If that number normalizes down to 7 touchdowns, 8 touchdowns, and not sitting at 13 touchdowns, we all of a sudden are taking a decent amount of points away from Mike Evans at 282, dropping him all the way down to, say, 240, 230, somewhere in that regard.
And that's not worth the pick now.
And it's not worth that high-end pick. So, there's a lot to say about the value of Chris Godwin this year. I don't think he's going to snake by that late in a lot of drafts. I think people are going to catch on. But
I don't. People hate Tampa. They just don't give him respect.
I would much rather have, let me just go to the straight wide receiver rankings here. And again, if you go back and watch any video from last year, I was super down, saying
we both were.
Tampa was super dog shit last year. If I were to, look at this wide receiver room, I'd rather have him than Calvin Ridley. I'd rather have him than George Pickens. I'd rather have him than Tank Dell. I'd rather have him than Terry McLaurin. I'd rather have him right now because of the issue with Rishi Rice than Rishi Rice. I'd think about T. Higgins, but I'd probably rather have him. I think they're both in the same regard. I'd rather have him over Christian Kirk. I'd rather have him over Zay Flowers and Keenan Allen, and definitely over Malik Neighbors. And so the question comes in, would I rather have him over DK Metcalf, right? Circling back full circle, the DK Metcalf debate here is that you could potentially see Chris Godwin going as high as a 4th round pick, depending on how people view some of these other wide receivers in the vein. If you're not willing to take a chance on Terry McLaurin that high or taking a chance on Neighbors that high, there's a very realistic possibility that you can see Godwin going off as somebody's potentially number 1 wide receiver on their team. And while it might not look optically very good on paper because he only had 2 touchdowns last year, a guy with 2 touchdowns getting 89 receptions.
Yeah.
And another player on the team getting 79 receptions and 13 touchdowns, there's bound to be a shift. And that's why Chris Godwin is really dependent upon the defenses he plays, because there's teams with, when I say defenses he plays, I'm talking about schemes that he's very good against and some that he's very bad against. And so he's not catching balls as much against that. And so it kind of plays in. And Mike Evans is a very reliable red zone threat. So if they get within the 20s and Chris Godwin doesn't happen to break one off, but the news is saying here, Joe, is that Chris Godwin is going into the slot this year. And
which helps the slots, which helps the catches.
That can be extremely sexy, enough to make me want to take him in the 4th round. But I think his value is really incredible. And if I had the choice of going Pittman in the 3rd round or Chris Godwin in the 4th or 5th round, I'd probably not take Pittman, and I'd probably settle in at Chris Godwin as my number 2 wide receiver and build my team a little. And then, like I said,
I don't think Godwin in the 4th round makes sense, but the whole point was how late you can get him. And then the other part of what's making them want to move him is this Jalen McMillan. I'm telling you, he's going to be a late round stasher that no one is riding. If you want to pull up his draft reports, third round kid, in the actual draft, and they're big on him. I mean, there's no other way to say it. They knew they needed to revamp their receiving core. A lot of good receivers went in this league in the third round, and like I said, I think that there's value there when you look at this guy when it's all said and done. And said,
if anything, Joe, the case for Jalen McMillan is a case against Mike Evans and not Chris Godwin. The reason I say that is that, looking at
he's built like Evans. He's got the 4.5 speed. He's got the height.
Looking at his draft profile, is that great? Jalen McMillan, excellent late round pick, stash pick in your drafts. Totally something to do. But why I bring that up is that, we just said Chris Godwin going to the slot. Jalen McMillan is probably going to go on the other side with Mike Evans. Again, Mike Evans, you're drafting him at totally top value if you're taking him in the second.
Don't draft Mike Evans.
And Jalen McMillan is a case against Mike Evans because of that reason, is that this is a guy, similar build, similar, very good skill set, younger. He's going to be the guy to take away. He's going to be the guy to take away touchdowns from Mike Evans to normalize Mike Evans back into that 5th round, 6th round pick that we know Mike Evans actually is, and not a 2nd round pick. But for Chris Godwin, taking Godwin in that 4th, 5th, 6th round, I'm comfortable with that because that is a normalized value for Chris Godwin. We're not overvaluing him. We're not undervaluing him. He's right at value. And if I had a selection of wide receivers, like I said, there's only a couple that I would really want, but they're all basically in similar or similarly concerning situations, a la Terry McLaurin with a new quarterback. T. Higgins, what's the health of Joe Burrow going to be? Christian Kirk, is he going to go back to what he was before Ridley or not? Keenan Allen, crowded. Zay Flowers, is he the guy? Is he the long-term guy? Tank Dell, crowded. George Pickens, who's going to be the quarterback? So all of those decisions come in and say, hey, maybe this year it's actually really smart to take a wide receiver in the 1st round, a la if you have a top 5. No, let me just hit it. Take a wide receiver in the 1st round in this, out of these guys, depending on your position, right? Depending on your position. CD, Tyreek, Jamar, Amon-Ra, A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, one of those guys, okay? Depending on where you pick. Then 2nd round, running back. 3rd round, tight end or running back. 4th round, maybe one of those wide receivers from that list of players that was already mentioned. And then circle back and just keep going. Keep it moving, right? There's a very good case to say that this is going to be a good year because there is a good high volume teams that getting an alpha or a guaranteed alpha is going to be kind of nice, that, you get the potential for 30 points a week and you really don't have to worry about, because Tyreek is an alpha despite Waddle being really, really good. CD, alpha. Jamar Chase, despite T. Higgins being there, alpha. Justin Jefferson, we're going to pause on him for a moment. Amon-Ra, alpha. A.J. Brown, alpha, despite Devonta Smith being there. We saw what that kind of shook down with last year. Garrett Wilson, alpha. We don't know what Mike Evans is going to do. We don't know what Aaron Rodgers is going to do, but whatever. Puka Nacua.
Oh, he's there.
He's there, but I want to see it for another season. I'm willing to take him, but I want to see it for another season.
Oh, I take him on the back end of the first.
Devontae, I'm not saying he shouldn't be there. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying for me to want to take him, he might not be one of those wide receivers that I want to take in the 1st round or beginning of the 2nd round, based upon how I might want to make up my team. So then I come back, Joe, and like I said, in terms of draft strategy here, maybe it is time to do that, because looking at Fantasy Pros' tier 3, which is 9 through 15 in their rankings, all of these guys are good. Devontae Adams, Marvin Harrison, Chris Olave, Brandon Ayuk, Pittman, London, DJ Moore, all of them are good, right? But if I'm looking at it and I can go, hey, man, I'm drafting in the top half of the first round. Okay, maybe I shouldn't take CD. Maybe I should take, Christian McCaffrey. Or say I'm in the middle of the first round and I say, wow, Breece, Bijan, that's looking good there. But then I can pair them up in the second round with potentially a Garrett Wilson, right? It all depends on what you're saying here, because my tier 3 of running backs, Rashad White, Josh Jacobs, Pacheco, Henry, A-Chain, Cook, Mixon, Kamara, Walker. Again, not mine, but Fantasy Pros. I might be willing to play around with a guy like A-Chain if I had a player like Breece Hall or like Bijan Robinson, but I might not be willing to do that if I took a wide receiver in the first round. But again, I can also avoid a little bit of that oversaturating. And that's the thing here too, Joe, is that if you oversaturate your wide receivers very, very early, then you might not be more willing to take a chance on a Jalen Hyatt or a Jalen McMillan later in the draft because you have too many already. I'm not saying that the first round is the time to make that decision. I'm not saying that the second or third round is the time to make that decision. But if by the 7th or 8th round, I've got 5 wide receivers on my team, or I've got 6 wide receivers on my team, I'm probably not going Jalen McMillan as a late stash pick. I'm probably not doing that because I have some weaknesses somewhere else that I need to cover
up. In a
up.
redraft league, that part's fair.
So why, if I want to take an opportunity on a Jalen McMillan, maybe it is that I go after a high-profile wide receiver set in the first 1 or 2 rounds, or first round only, and then come back and take running backs. Now, next week when we come on, we'll make the case for Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson in this discussion.
It's the Jets week next week.
We talked a lot about wide receivers today, but next week we'll take the foray into Breece Hall and to Bijan Robinson, and to say that there's consideration to be had if I'm drafting 2, 3, 4, 5, that based off of what we've seen out of wide receivers today and what we haven't seen out of running backs, that it makes more sense to draft a guy like that than it does to take CD, Tyreek, or even Jamar Chase.
And we're definitely diving into that. And also, hopefully by then we'll have the schedule out and we can start diving into the real peaks and valleys of each individual player going through it, give a much better detailed outlook. We start getting a little bit more information each week for the NFL.
So we appreciate everybody joining us today. We'll be back same time around 3:45, 4 o'clock next Tuesday, going on until 6 o'clock. We appreciate everybody joining us. If you liked what you saw today, please subscribe on our YouTube page. Continue to follow us on X for our lives on X. If you'd like to transition over to YouTube, we would appreciate that. Also, it's a good chance to leave us a comment and communicate with us during the show. So again, Joe and Bob here from Local Football Flavor. We'll catch you next week.